After nearly 4 years, was the Xbox Series S a mistake? The Xbox Series S has been on, the wrong side of many headlines lately, and after nearly 4 years of basic availability, the question becomes, was the Series S a mistake? Now, Microsoft's strategy for this console generation was to launch two different consoles that are nearly, or I should say, mostly identical, and one being the most powerful, which is this guy, the Series X, and then the Series S was supposed to be the affordable option that they actually expected to sell in higher volume. The goal would be that if they created two very similar spec consoles, it wouldn't be hard for developers who are targeting the Series X to bring their game also to the Series S with minor changes and really just changing the graphic fidelity, and that it should be bada bing, bada boom, super easy. However, nearly 4 years later, the real narrative has come out that, hey, this guy is being held back by the Series S because developers are more targeting the Series S. There's just game delays. And so I think it's worth diving into the details here nearly, again, 4 years later about should Microsoft have launched the Series S and was their strategy sound? We're roughly halfway through the generation and nothing's going to change dramatically here, but let's dig into the details. So the headlines are, there's new ones, there's old ones, but here's one for you. Quantum Error said that the Series S was making it harder to develop for Xbox. They really dive into, hey, we got to target two different boxes, the lower requirements, it's just more overhead at the end of the day. Also, the developers were claiming that many studios are asking Microsoft to drop the mandatory S compatibility. Now, Microsoft, I believe, makes it a requirement that whatever features are on the Series X must be on the Series S. And so the most notable example of this during the past couple years has been Baldur's Gate 3. Now, they go on to say that the Xbox Series S isn't holding it back, but when you dug into the details of what was really the issue, it was actually local co-op, I believe, or split screen co-op was the problem for Baldur's Gate 3. But that was a huge headline. Baldur's Gate 3 was the top dog for many months. It's still a genre favorite for many people. And the fact that it did launch on the Series S does mean that the box is capable. However, there is no ignoring the fact from these headlines that the Series S does create additional work for developers. Now, for studios like Activision and Raven and all these multi-$100 million entities, that's not a big deal. However, when you are looking at smaller developers, indies, the indie game developers of the world, it does become a burden, might be the wrong word, but it's definitely overhead that they have to consider that they're going to need additional resources meaning developers, time, material, and all of that to bring their title to the Series S. While Microsoft and Xbox have made the best effort they can to make the process as easy as possible, we know from the headlines and from other developers that having two different boxes does create additional work and it does take up additional time, which makes it harder to launch things on the console. There's also been other narratives that, hey, Microsoft's Xbox certification is tough and challenging, and that's also, that's just the nature of the beast, especially when you have two consoles, you have the Xbox Live requirement, sometimes there's Game Pass stuff and everything else. And those are, headlines you can go find yourself. But these were the three that I pulled out. However, when it comes to console sales, the story changes a bit because there was a growing movement for a fraction of a second says, just get rid of the Series S. Well, first off, that doesn't solve the problem because it's already in market and sales. Actually, I have one of each. And so you can't just do that. However, from the leaked FTC documents from a couple years ago, the sales split here is a really telling story. And this is why Microsoft went down this path at the end of the day. They said, look, if the lower price console we know will sell at a better rate. Now, based on these projections, which again are a bit dated, I believe from 2022, 75% of sales were expected to be of the Series S and 25% of the X. Now, if you go talk to different analysts in the industry, those numbers have likely shifted in favor of the Series X, primarily because there's a couple points that need to be brought up. First off, this was during the console shortage, right? And so most of the consoles that were coming off the line from Microsoft during this timeline were the Series S. So the Series S quite literally sold more because it was more available. Right now, it's expected to be that the market split is probably closer to like 50-50-ish. Just take those rough numbers. So the Series X has definitely climbed because, again, availability is definitely much closer or much more available. You can walk into Best Buy or whatever your favorite store is and grab one. Now, the question becomes, what happens with the Series S? Like, what is the actual issue here? So Digital Foundry has done a wonderful job, as they traditionally do, about really comparing consoles and games and graphic fidelity and everything else. So I'm going to use Starfield here as an example because it's most recent, and Starfield put out an update that allowed the Xbox Series S to either have a performance mode or a graphics mode. And you can definitely see the difference here. You can look at the shadows, although hilariously, the performance mode on the left looks a little bit more realistic in my opinion, because shadows typically aren't like, depending on the time of the day, I should say, sometimes shadows are straight lines, but the left one actually looks a little bit better in the shadows, but the people and the general overall appearance is definitely better on the right. However, we now have a Series S with performance mode and a visual mode. It did not launch like this. This is based on a recent update. Now, it's worth pointing out, and I cannot ignore this. So Starfield is a super complex game. It potentially might even be one of the most complex and demanding games on the Xbox console right now. I'm sure there's other titles that give it a run for the money, but I think we can all agree it's in that like top 5% for sure, based on everything, if not the top 1%. The Series S at some point during the visual mode drops down to, and I'm not making this up, 432p based on Digital Foundry's pixel counting. And so that is not really acceptable. However, that is the choice you have with things like performance mode and visual mode to really increase the visual fidelity. The reason why I point out Starfield specifically for this video is that Starfield, again, is one of the most complex games, and Bethesda was able to make it on the Series S and allow it to have all the features and everything else. Yes, it did not launch with performance mode or visual mode. Those options, those just came. It took them time to get there, but the game did launch on the Series S, and so it is possible, right? If you have enough time and enough resources, and this is what I was hinting at earlier, it is possible to launch on the Series S in a good state, but without having too much visual overhead, if you will, at the end of the day. However, I think we all can acknowledge that Starfield has a massive budget. They are not an indie studio, and they were able to put the resources in, and let's be real here, this just launched not that long ago. So it's a bit of an outlier here, Starfield, because again, they were able to do all this stuff. They've proven that it's technically possible. However, it did take them time, which kind of brings it back to the point of this video was the Series S a mistake? I think the lesson here is that Microsoft's initial expectation that targeting two different consoles, even though the specs are similar, was actually the mistake, not launching two different consoles. Now, this image from TweetDown here breaks out the exact specs, and I think this is where the mistake was made. I don't personally think the Series S itself was a mistake. I think the mistake was that the hardware deviations, while they are very similar and they're on the same architecture, are enough that is what's causing developers headache. So if you have a great time machine and you can go back in time, you need to go tell Microsoft, he's like, hey, either you launch the Series S and like that's all you launch and that's just what it is, and you guys go for the value price console, which you know will sell exceptionally well, or you go for the high performance console, the Series X, but instead of an S, you need to launch a console that has half the storage and no DVD drive for about $100 less. And so that way, I believe that would be like $399 and $499 price points, and that would probably have served Microsoft a heck of a lot better than where they are at now. I think the real mistake that Microsoft made, again, is just that the hardware deviations are too great and that they cause enough overhead that it causes developers pain when they're trying to figure out how they're going to target these boxes, because they probably go in with the dev kit and they're targeting a Series X and they're like, okay, then we'll just turn off certain features and that should be the S. But it hasn't worked out that way. And I think that is the actual feedback that Microsoft is hearing. Not that the Series S is a bad console, it's that your hardware deviations are too much. So how will we know if Microsoft learned a lesson, or what lesson Microsoft learned? While we are far and away from hearing about the next generation console, that will tell us the true tale. I don't believe Microsoft has ever launched like this two-tier strategy out of the gate. Someone will point out the Xbox One X, which launched later, but that was more of like an overdrive of the original console, not so much a deviation, and it came later and there were different caveats to that. So I think the real telling story will be like, what is Microsoft's next console strategy? If they go with the two-tier strategy, then I am probably wrong in my assumption that the hardware deviations were not too much and that it's really just developers maybe not giving the effort. I don't quite know. I don't want to bash any indie developers. Building games is hard enough without YouTubers slapping you down for saying things. So there you go. Do I personally think the Series S was a mistake? I don't think so. I mean, it was the volume leader. It's a good value price console when you pair it with Game Pass. However, it set itself up for not failure. Failure is absolutely the wrong word to use here. It set itself up for bad headlines because it's always the little brother console, which means that anytime there's ever an issue of performance on the X, so the X might have performance issues, who's getting the blame? It's going to be the Series S. So it becomes the fall child, if you will, of the Xbox console, which doesn't do well for Microsoft's headlines. So I'd love to know what you guys think about this stuff, because I certainly have my opinions, and that's my narrative and how I am digesting everything that's going on lately with all of this different stuff. But do you guys think the Series S was an actual mistake? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.